Yay! Okay, cool. So, again, where we ended up. We tried to again, super quickly and just in the way that we can get a grip on it, motivate this idea of how to assess modal logic claims, right? And the core to it was this possible world semantics, where we use worlds and how they access each other, how they can see each other to tell us when possibility and necessity claims are true, right? So what I want to do for the last 35 minutes or so is talk about two competing accounts of what possible worlds are. And the first account we'll look at is genuine modal realism or Lewisian modal realism. It's a very straightforward account in one sense. It's also absolutely mad. It is completely crazy. So this is an account developed by David Lewis. Originally, I think it's the first couple papers were in the late 60s. So the core idea for Lewis, for modal realism, is that possible worlds are just like this thing that we're in right now. They are giant concrete objects of the same type as the great big cosmosy thing that we're all a part of. Or put in strictest full terms, worlds for Lewis are maximally connected space-time regions. So what this really means is that basically a possible world for David Lewis is everything that's in one interconnected space-time causal region. So, everything from the Big Bang until the Big Crunch, that's all part of one possible world. And for Lewis, there's a whole bunch of these. There's a whole bunch of these.
So it's just many worlds theory?
It is something very similar to it. So, here's, again, the basic idea. Worlds for Lewis are maximally connected space-time regions. We'll try and cash that out. The core idea is that anything that's spatially connected in the same space as, or stands in any kind of spatial relation to, is going to be a part of the same world. And so it might be easier to think of world here as like cosmos, right? So notably, spatial connectivity here just means you stand in any kind of spatial relation, above, below, next to, right? 80 billion light years away from any spatial relation means you're in the same possible world.
But isn't it inference, the first one?
Say again?
Inference? That was like in the homework, right? Like symmetry, reflection.
Oh, transitivity.
Transitive.
Yeah.
Transitive,
sorry. Yeah. So what we mean by transitive here, right, is that if A stands in a spatial relation to B, and B stands in a spatial relation to C, then A must stand in some kind of spatial relation to C. Doesn't really care what it is, there's going to be some. If A is 1 billion light years away from B, and B is 3 billion light years away from C, well then A is 13 billion light years away from C. Bingo. Again, this is the idea. So put really, really roughly, Lewis's idea is that if there's any kind of potential causal relationship or spatial relationship between two things, they're in the same world. We don't really want to put it in those terms because potential is just another way to say possible. But again, if you stand in any spatial relation, you're in the same world. Yeah.
What's spatial?
Good. So this is literally just having to do with space, right? So again, above, below, next to, some distance away from, anything like that. Yes.
Excluding time?
Time would also be part of it, right? Because again, to go back, it's space-time, right? So it's just in the same space-time region. So if you're temporally related to, you are spatially related to.
Does he also go as far as that there are more than one universes? So metaverse.
But then everything is connected.
So here's the thing that's going to separate them. These different worlds are not going to be spatially related to each other. They are going to be giant, distinct space-time regions. And this is actually the kind of view that we have in multiverse theory, right? You have, here's one giant timeline. Here's another giant timeline. They're not in the same space. We can metaphorically talk about them being in some big space of worlds, but that's just a metaphor. They stand in no spatial relation to each other. Yes?
Like when you talk about different words of the world, in this case, symbols like A and B, for example, they could be this situation that you talk about, like 3 million years of light, and that's what you talk about.
Any kind of spatial or temporal relation.
Yeah, okay, but like the comparison is between these situations, but they are still in the same space.
They are still in the same world.
Okay.
Yeah. So importantly, one of the key things Lewis says is, okay, we still want to differentiate this thing that we're all part of, that anyone who has ever actually existed has been a part of, from the other giant concrete space-time regions. So instead of having actual be indicating something special, actual is an indexical. It's a bit like here or now. We don't think there's anything special about this location. It's just what I mean when I say the word here. Similarly, the word I doesn't mean me. It means whoever uses it. It's an indexical.
How do we know for sure that like the logical necessities and possibilities are working the same here in this universe as in all the other ones?
We're going to come to that. That's going to be one of the problems. Again, we want to get the idea first, and then we'll talk about some issues with it. But yeah, this is going to be an issue, right? So, one consequence of understanding worlds as anything that's causally or spatially related is that if there are going to be multiple worlds, they have to be causally and spatially isolated from each other. Right? So, for example, in like Rick and Morty, when they travel to other worlds, well, according to Lewis, if you could travel there, it's all part of the same world. Because that would mean that there's some kind of causal relation. And if you can causally interact with it, then it's part of this world. Again, here's the reasoning. He's going to use spatial and causal relations to characterize and define what a world is. And there's a very important reason for wanting to do this. He doesn't want to use any kind of modal notion to characterize what a world is. And if he doesn't, if he successfully avoids using any modal notion to characterize worlds, he can offer a reductive analysis of possibility and necessity. So what do I mean by that? Right? He doesn't have to take modal stuff as something new. He can understand it entirely in terms of these other simple things that we know and love: spatial relations and causation. He's going to have to believe in some weird shit. Lots of these giant, causally isolated, spatially isolated worlds, cosmoses. But that's fine. He is going to pay, to use the Quinean stuff, pay for this weird ideology in terms of ontology. I think there are these giant concrete objects. These giant concrete objects help me understand these notions. This is very neat. Yes?
I don't really understand that last part.
Cool. So let's be clear about Lewis's views, and then we'll talk about, again, the upshot. Right? So Lewis thinks the key things. He thinks possible worlds exist. They're giant concrete objects, just like this. They are delineated by spatial, temporal, and causal relations. He thinks that actual is just an indexical expression like here or now or I. That there's nothing special about this world as compared to the other ones. They're all giant concrete objects. They're unified by their spatial temporal relations between their parts. And they're causally and spatially isolated because if you're interrelated in these ways, you're all part of one big world. Now, what's the advantage of buying all of this? At no point in how he understands what worlds are does he use the notions of possible or necessary. It's just about spatial and causal relations. So this means he can provide a reductive definition of possibility and necessity. Possibly A is true if and only if there exists some giant fuck-off concrete object out there where A is any sentence you like. Why is it possible that my sweater is gray? Because there's a giant concrete object that includes my sweater being gray.
On what level do those worlds differ? Do they only differ, like, do they have the same laws of physics as we do?
Good. So this was his kind of, yeah. So one of the things that he needs to tell us is how many worlds are there? Cash them out, right? Nothing said so far addresses this question. Right? And to be honest, we're not going to really deal with how he kind of settles this, because we're just interested in what's his account of what the hell worlds are. That's really good enough for us for now. Yeah.
In the past slide, what I don't understand is how we go to the possible worlds are unified by the spatial temporal relations to parts. Okay, so they are related, and then possible worlds are causally and spatially isolated.
Good. So if they weren't isolated from each other, if there were any causal or spatial temporal relations between worlds, they would not be distinct worlds. Because if there's any causal or spatial temporal relations, then it's part of a single world. Right? So again, you can think about this metaphorically, right? You've got this big cluster of objects that are defined in terms of all their spatial temporal causal relations. Suppose you have another one, and it has just one little part here that stands in a causal relation to something over here. If there's a causal relationship here, then that means this is just one big object. Because if you stand in any spatial-temporal causal relation, any way, shape, or form, you're part of a single world. So the only way you could have distinct worlds is if they're causally, spatial-temporally isolated. They don't interact. They don't stand in any spatial relation to each other. Because as soon as they do, it's just all big parts of one giant world. Does that make sense?
This is always we're talking about possibilities, not about, or not about, also about past.
Past things are in the world too, right? Right? If they stand in any kind of causal or spatial relation, spatial-temporal relation, they're in that one world.
But at the same time, they could be isolated.
Again, we have two different things going on. First, we're asking, let's think about all the parts. What are the parts of a given world? The parts of a world are anything that are spatially, temporally, or causally related to each other. Right? Take some object. Find all the things that stand in any of the relations to this thing. Spatial, temporal, or causal. Cool. You have now found all the things that are in that object's world. Okay? We set that object aside. Let's grab another object. Cool, we grab this thing. Okay, let's find out what's in its world. We find all of the things that are spatially, temporally, causally related to it. If it turns out that there's a spatial, temporal, or causal relation here, fuck, it's all part of the same giant world. We need to have them be different sets of relations there. Otherwise, it's just one big thing. This is why, again, the worlds have to be isolated. And then the idea, once we have these isolated objects, once they are separate, is we can put them to use to do our modal logic. The existence of these giant things, that's what's going to tell us whether certain things are possible or certain things are necessary.
Okay, so the parts of the actual is an indexable expression, and possible worlds are irreducible entities. I don't really understand those.
Okay. So actual as an indexical means that there's nothing special about this giant object. This one is just one world. There's nothing special. If we think about some other possible world, some other giant concrete space-time unified whole, it's actual relative to that. In the same way that there's nothing special about here. The fact that I'm here doesn't make this location somehow special or unique. It could be over there, it could be over there. This is the idea. And this is what we mean by they're irreducible as well. They're not going to be understood as some other type of object. They're just giant concrete objects. And what they do, the role they play, is their existence guarantees possibilities, and if all of them are a certain way, then it guarantees necessities. Yes?
Wouldn't you say that existence is relation?
Existence is not a relation. Existence is something we know how to express. How do we express existence?
Oh.
Again, this is what Lewis is doing. Lewis is paying for the notion of modality by committing himself ontologically to these giant concrete objects. So the thought here, again, as we've got it here, is Lewis is paying for the notion of modality. He's cashing this ideological notion out in terms of ontological commitments. So remember when we were talking about ontological commitment, I told you about this kind of dance, right? Simpler ontology, more complex ideology. Simple ideology, more complex ontology. Lewis definitely likes the second one. I'm going to believe in these giant space-time objects, and by believing in them, I do not have to kind of postulate spooky modality. It's a view. It's a view. So again, the core concept here, Lewis commits himself to these giant concrete objects, which are individuated by the spatial, temporal, or causal relationship between their parts. And the existence of these things is what then lets him understand modality. It's a reductive analysis. And this reduction is the selling point for Lewis's view. This is the big sell. Hey, I can tell you what modality is. It just turns out to be the existence of these giant things. But there are many, many, many problems with Lewis's account. One of them that we've already mentioned is there is absolutely no epistemic story here. We are in many ways left up for grabs as to what kind of thing and how the worlds are. It might turn out that there's only 17 worlds, and they all play around with the color of my sweater. So all of that stuff about real possibility and logical possibility and stuff, oh no, that just turns out to be just what color is my sweater. Everything else is necessary. That'd be bad.
And so just to check, okay, so the reduction part is that there are no accessibility relations because worlds can be related.
Good. So the reduction here is that we can analyze any modal claim purely in terms of the existence of certain kinds of worlds. So we still need accessibility. But importantly, it's always going to be cashed out as these worlds exist. Why is possibly my sweater gray? Because there's a world where this thing has that color. It's an existential or an ontological commitment to explain away a possibility claim. Or similarly, a necessity claim would be, because all the worlds are like this.
Is that the worlds need to see each other. And so that can't be possible.
Well, so this is the thing. He needs to give us some understanding of how this accessibility works. It cannot be spatial, it cannot be causal. This is another problem. Whatever accessibility, seeing, amounts to for Lewis, it needs to not be causal, it needs to not be spatial. It looks like, right, cool, you've gotten rid of one primitive notion and replaced it with something different.
In what?
So again, this is another difficulty, right? But the nice thing is we see why it's a new difficulty for him, right? Yeah, did you have a question?
Could you please repeat the part about what the reduction specifically entails?
Yes. So the reduction is, like, he doesn't have to postulate any kind of modal notions. He doesn't have to say that, hey, possibility and necessity are out there in some way. The ideology here can be reduced, cashed out purely in terms of the existence of some worlds, some concrete objects. So, are there these worlds? If there are, cool. Then the diamond claim turns out to be true. That's just what modality means, according to Lewis. That's just what it means. It was always and forever secretly talk about the existence of these giant things.
Right now, we don't know if those worlds are even there, right?
Yes. So this is, again, the problem about there's no epistemic story here at all. Right? He has not given us, at least as we've talked about, any reason to think that there are enough worlds. It could just be, if it's just, hey, the existence of the worlds is when possibilities are there. There might only be 17, and they might only be concerned with what color my sweater is. Every other way that the worlds are could be exactly like this one is, except there's one where my sweater is green, one where it's gray, one where it's blue, one where it's red, one where it's purple. You see, right? This could just, we are in some sense at the mercy of how the worlds turn out. That's not so great. Now we can actually sharpen this even more. Lewis's account, however we think about these things, delivers some very weird results. In particular, we can think about these two. So Lewis's account, by definition, cannot give us a world where absolutely nothing exists. So this seems plausible, right? You might think that it's possible nothing, literally nothing at all, exists. Lewis can't have that. Because worlds are great big wholes, complexes built up of their parts. If there are no parts, there's no world.
It was the empty set.
The empty set would have to exist in that world.
Yeah.
But then it's not empty. The world isn't empty. It would have the empty set in it. Yeah. What we need is the stuff inside the empty set. That's all that there is. Oh, crap, but that's nothing. So, okay, the empty world, that's weird. Maybe not the end of the world. Here's something that's really plausible. Right? Think about this sort of multiverse theory again, right? You might think that there's something like island universes. That is, it seems possible you could have a single possible world with two parts that never interact, that don't stand in any spatial relation to each other.
And it would be two separate worlds.
Lewis has to say they are, right? But it seems at least logically possible that we can have a single world that has these two utterly spatially and causally unrelated parts.
So it is possible.
This is the problem. Lewis has to say it can't be because of the way he defines worlds. But we can cash out, or at least make sense of, this being a legitimate possibility. His account doesn't seem to capture everything we think is intuitively possible. That is the problem. Yeah.
Isn't that a semantic matter?
Could be. It could be. So this is a way Lewis can kind of push back on it, right? He could say, really what you're doing is inadvertently thinking of two different possible worlds and mashing them together. That's a move. That's a move. But again, you see why Lewis is forced to say something along those lines. He cannot say there is a world with these kind of distinct parts.
Wouldn't that, just seeing it from the perspective of multiverse theory, wouldn't that just, would they be spatially related in the sense that they are both originating from within a Big Bang?
So this is, again, kind of what we're thinking of with this island universe case is that it's a single world with two different Big Bangs. And they're never going to causally interact, and there isn't any real spatial sense in which they're spatially related. They're just part of the same universe. If we can make sense of that, if we think that that's at all sensible, that it is logically possible, then Lewis's view has a problem. Now, the last objection is a really kind of funny one. But it's probably the one with the best bite against Lewis's story. And it's often called the Humphrey objection. Okay. So, everyone know who Hubert Humphrey is? Probably not. We can do it an easier way. We could do it with my sweater again. Right? So remember, we've been talking about the possibility of this thing being gray. This very thing being gray. According to Lewis, that means that there's a world where this very thing exists and is gray. Right? That's just a reductive analysis, right? That's the top line, right? Problem. This very thing cannot exist in two possible worlds. Because if this very thing exists in multiple worlds, then there's a point of connection and they're in a single possible world. So, how does Lewis get out the idea that this thing could be gray? Lewis says this stands in what we'll call a counterpart relation to a different object. We can give you an example. Possibly, I'm Dutch. How do I know this? Well, I can take someone who's a counterpart and I could say, there but for the grace of God go I. That is, we take a different individual, how they are, and we say, oh, I am similar to them, hence I possibly am like they are. So why is this thing possibly gray? Because there's a different object in another possible world that's a sweater that is gray. Now, okay, so do we see the kind of general idea?
Same or a different world?
It has to be, it's a different world, right? Different world. Now, the reason why it's got to be a different object is because it can't be overlapping. It'll be a different thing. Now, here's the worry. Why should this object give a shit about what happens to this other thing? It's a different object. I want to know, could this thing be gray? I don't care if there's something else that's gray. I want to know, could this thing have a property? So the reason the objection gets going is Humphrey loses an election. And he says to himself, I could have won. And it's very, very little consolation to say, hey, it's cool. Someone else in another possible world won the election. Humphrey cares about what happens to him. But Lewis forces Humphrey to care about what happens to other things. It delivers in kind of undigestible results when we think about local possibilities. And this is really bad.
Yes, like, it's not possible because since you're talking about the same object or not, then they have a causal relation. So Lewis' theory goes.
Exactly. If it's the very same object, then you never left the one possible world you were in. It always has to be a different one, but as soon as it's a different one, then it's a different one. And that's not what we were talking about. We asked about this thing. Could this thing be gray? Could Humphrey himself have won the election? Not could someone else have won. We know that already. He didn't win. Nixon won.
Like to be in different worlds, they must be different objects, although you're talking about the same thing.
Yes, that is the problem. So, yes, please.
Sorry, did we talk about the incredulous star?
We didn't talk about it. So the important thing here, again, for Lewis's story, the core of it, the absolute core of it, is this idea that worlds are these giant concrete objects, and they're individuated by the spatial and causal relation of their parts. That's how he can have a reductive story. But as soon as his reductive story gets going, the very core of it leads to a whole bunch of issues. You can't deliver the right possibility claims, or at least many intuitive claims. And it tells a very, 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 very strange story about what happens with individual modal claims. Yes, please.
I also don't understand how two different or two the same different objects can be in different worlds, because if you take a human, for example, and if there's a human in this world, and they're not connected, they do have the same like lifespan, like getting older and stuff,
Yeah.
going gray, then
There's some kind of connection there.
yeah.
Yeah, so what he has to rely on is an idea about similarity. So similarity for Lewis can be a trans-world relation. Which is fair. Similarity isn't causal, it's not spatial. But it is just similarity. And at least in some cases, we seem to want identity. So that's the issue here. Hey. Good timing, assholes.
There are like EP calls in the door.
Yeah. Nobody did.
Yeah,
Okay.
ends are not even.
So I think the important thing that we got through here again was this Lewisian account of what possible worlds are, right? For Lewis, possible worlds are these giant concrete objects. And by postulating these, he can give us a kind of reductive analysis of box and diamond talk. And that'll be fine. I think this is good enough for what we wanted to cover. So I'll leave up again the slides on linguistic ersatz-ism. We won't talk about it. It's okay. We don't even have to do anything about this on the exam. It'll be totally fine. I'll ask you some questions on Lewis, but not on the ersatz-ism. Yes, please.
No, I have a different question.
Okay. So importantly, again, what we'll do going forward, right? The things that are important for today that I really want to emphasize again is this notion of modality, of modal logic being about modes of truth, right? Possibility and necessity. The general concept of modal logic being understood in this terms of relations between worlds. The sort of triple that we had, where we have worlds, we have an accessibility relation between them, and then things are true in those worlds, and it's that accessibility, the world seeing each other, that says when things are true and when they're false. And then we talked about one particular way of cashing out what worlds could be. It's a very Baroque way. This crazy kind of concrete approach. So, that's good. The core of what we did is, again, trying to extend our formal system to make sense of some talk that it couldn't before. In that case, in today's case, it was making sense of possibility and necessity talk. What we're going to talk about next week is a similar kind of thing. In particular, there seems to be some talk that FOL, as we've discussed so far, possibly can't quite make sense of. And this is talk about properties. So a really cheap and cheery example, right? Your t-shirt and his sweater are black, so it seems like there is something that both of these objects have. Blackness. But of course, if we think about how we would express some of this in FOL, that move doesn't make sense. Because we would say they satisfy a predicate. So there is something? So this is what we're going to talk about next week. We're going to talk about this idea of properties and their relations to predicates. Now, as I said at the top, right, there's quite a bit of reading, at least initially in the syllabus described here. You don't have to read both chapters, just read the first chapter. It's the first 15 pages or so from the Edwards book. Have a look at it. For the homework, right, there's some questions about this possible world stuff we talked about today. We'll talk about it next Wednesday. As a reminder, there's no tutorial this Friday because I'll be away. But we'll talk about all the possible world stuff in our next tutorial. Thank you guys for coming. Have a lovely, lovely rest of the week. And yeah, we'll see you. Please.
Well, I have a question about the tutorial because I'm not able to be at the tutorial. I can do the lectures. Is it possible to record it?
I can ask people when we do it, and we'll go from there. And if not, I'm very happy to talk with you about it afterwards. Cool. Thanks, guys. Have a lovely rest of the week.